Okay, so we're on chapter 27, the laws of Torah study. So one of the mitzvahs in the Torah is to study the Torah. In fact, those of us who are just started on the 19th of Kislev, we restarted the daily study of Tanya. So right there in the very first parak of Tanya, when the Alter Rebbe wants to give an example of a mitzvah, which is he says that it's a mitzvah that everybody's incumbent upon, is to study the Torah. He elaborates on that, and many places throughout Tanya, the Alter Rebbe sort of uses the opportunity to emphasize the centrality of and the importance of this mitzvah. The Alter Rebbe actually authored, and we all know, familiar with Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. Alter Rebbe wrote a Shulchan Aruch. In addition to that, Alter Rebbe also wrote a separate book with 4 chapters on Hilchas Talmud Torah, the laws of studying Torah, and it's a monumental work of the Alter Rebbe. Tremendous novelty in that book, and it's kind of could be considered a book which is way past its times. In other words, the Alter Rebbe wrote a Shulchan Aruch, but many contemporaries of the Alter Rebbe, or even later generations, wrote halachic works, which were kind of compilations of the halachic output of the halachic authorities until then, and sort of bringing it all together. So Alter Rebbe has his own style, which is very special, and for Chabad Chassidim, it's, we treat that as the final word, but it's not in and of itself unusual for somebody of Alter Rebbe's time and age to do that. Just one moment, okay? However, with the laws of Talmud Torah that Alter Rebbe wrote, the nature of the compilation is such that it really, you're seeing a compilation, you might think it belongs in 5 generations earlier. It's kind of the style of the Rambam, and the reason is because there isn't so much to go by. It's not a topic which so many people had spoken about before the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe was really getting down to the raw bones of what it says in the Gemara and figuring it out in a way that hadn't really been done before until today. The Alter Rebbe's work on Hilchos Talmud Torah is considered really a primary source, not just in Chabad, but in the world over. Anybody looking at the topic of the laws of Talmud Torah, of Torah study, has to uses that book of the Alter Rebbe as one of the codes, primary codes. Well, here in the Kitzur, it's as is the name of the Kitzur, it's brief. It's just a few sifim, which we'll go through. Okay. So we finished the laws of morning prayers. After prayers, time should be set aside for the study of Torah. It is necessary that this study period be on a regular basis so that you will not skip them, even if it means earning big profits. So the idea is, let's see the footnote here. In Talmud Yerushalmi, such a person is called a man of faith, for he firmly believes that whatever profit is destined to make, God will send his way even after he finishes his Torah lessons. So there are two points over here, really. One point is that a person is supposed to have a time in the day that is kavua, that is fixed for Torah study, and that no matter what, come that time, even if you could be making a lot of money, he's going to study Torah. And the other point which he's making here is that ideally that time should be immediately after the morning prayers. So like in yeshiva, where a person is studying Torah the whole day, so then immediately after the morning prayers, there's a break. Then go and have breakfast, and then you're going to continue learning for the rest of the day. But if a person is not in the yeshiva, so then even if you just have a few minutes, but something very, he says, look, if you must attend to a very important matter, you should first study Torah, at least one verse or one law, and then take care of your affairs, and then your daily study period. So I'm not sure, but I think that perhaps one could make the argument that nowadays the text of our prayer includes within it words of Torah. For example, after the Amidah, we say verses from the Torah, we say even the Mishnah, we say Psalms. So all of those things to fulfill our obligation to say at least one Torah verse or one law, that we fulfill just by doing the siddur the way we have it today. Perhaps I'm suggesting, I'm not sure, but
this is why in the Tehillat Hashem they put the Torah bracha before, right? You have to say the so you have to
right. You
say
gotta say that at the beginning of the prayers, right? Because there are portions of the prayer that the Torah said. But nevertheless, that would only fulfill the bare minimum of one Torah verse or one law, if you have something really important to tend to. So if, let's say, you're rushing because you have to go to work, but then the first opportunity you have, whether it's your lunch break or you have a late morning break or after, whatever it is, there has to be a time during the day that is fixed for Torah study. It doesn't have to be a long time, it could be 10 minutes. But that time, whatever time it is, it's fixed. Some communities have established Torah study groups that meet immediately after prayers, and every God-fearing man should join them. So if you go to your shul where everybody stays around after davening to study Torah, so then one should join them. And this is also something which we saw recently in Tanya, that Rabbi spoke about in the evening between Mincha and Ma'ariv, that people shouldn't just sit around and schmooze, that there should be time set aside to learn Torah.
Is there a reason halachically why it should be right after prayers? Is it kind of like Tikkun Chatzos where it's a holy time? Or
there's if I'm not mistaken, it's based on a verse or there's some Beis HaKnesses or Beis HaMedrash. There's some, I don't remember what it is, but I think there's some verse that says Sheikhi don't say. I forget the verse, but I think there's some verse that alludes to it. That one goes, there should ideally be sort of no jump from davening without interruption into Torah study. Okay, now we so this was, okay, every person should have a set time to Torah study after davening. Now we're sort of zooming out a little bit and giving a bigger overview to the mitzvah. Every Jewish man must study Torah no matter whether he is poor or rich, whether he is healthy or suffering pain, whether he is young or old. So here it's every Jewish man. A Jewish woman does not have the mitzvah of Torah study for the sake of Torah study. A woman's mitzvah of Torah study is primarily to know what to do. She has to learn all the laws. She has to learn things which are practically relevant to her. But a Jewish man has the obligation to study Torah. And again, poor, rich, young, old, etc. Even if it's not relevant, even if he's already mastered all the laws, he knows everything he, quote, has to know, it's still a mitzvah for him to study Torah. And as we know, Chassidus talks about this a lot, Parak H, chapter 5 of Tanya, coming up in Chitas this week, that tremendous connection and vekus that we have with Hashem when we study Torah. Even a beggar who goes door to door must set aside a certain time for Torah study during the day and the night, as it is written, you shall meditate in it day and night. So a person is supposed to have time. Before we said you have to have a time during the day, but really a person should also make sure, in addition to the one time of the day, which is fixed, that sometime during the day hours and sometime during the night hours, he should study at least a little bit of Torah. In the summer, it gets difficult because it might not be the night until 9, 10 o'clock, and you're going to sleep already if you're, but one should try by day and by night to study Torah. The Gemara talks about Hillel Mechayev Aniyim. That Hillel, who was a pauper, famous story that he didn't have enough money to pay the entrance fee into the Beis HaMedrash, and he climbed up onto the roof and he listened to the Torah through the window in the roof, the skylight, and then he fell asleep and he got snowed in, and he was discovered there the next day. So he was a very, very poor man. And the Gemara says that Hillel Mechayev Aniyim, that Hillel obligates the poor people to Torah study. In other words, if Hillel can do it, then nobody else can say, "Oh, I'm too poor for this." And similarly, Rabbi, who was a very wealthy man, is Mechayev Ashirin, because nobody could say, "Oh, I'm too wealthy, I have too much business affairs to take care of, I don't have time to study Torah," because nobody was more wealthy and more inundated with affairs to take care of than Rabbi was, and he also had time. And the Rebbe would often quote this and say, well, it seems a little bit strange, like, what's it got to do with Hillel? Either I'm obligated to study Torah because I'm obligated, or I have an excuse that I'm too poor or too rich. How does the fact that Hillel did it pertain to a poor or a rich person nowadays. And the Rebbe will explain that the idea is that you find time to the things that are important to you, the things that you are passionate about, you make them happen. And so Rabbi Mechayev Aniyim is because a person may legitimately be too poor to be able to study Torah. But if you were to really take in and appreciate the value of Torah study, taking the message from Hillel, then it would become so important to him that he would, by hook or by crook, find time for it. If a person lacks the knowledge to study Torah, or it is impossible for him to study because he is burdened with too many concerns, he should support others who engage in Torah study, and consider it as though he has himself a study Torah. As the rabbis of blessed memory explained, the verse "Rejoice, Zavulon, when you're going out and Yisachar in your tents," which is from Parshas Vayechi, V'zayz HaBracha, where Moshe Rabbeinu blesses each one of the tribes before his passing. So he talks about Zavulun are going out. That means they are, Zavulun and Yisachar entered into partnership. Zavulun engaged in business. Yisachar supported Yisachar so that they would be free to engross in the study of Torah. The tents referring to the tents of Torah. And Yisachar didn't just study Torah themselves, they were also teachers. They would travel around and teach the Jewish people. So here we're saying if a person doesn't have the means to study Torah, then one way to compensate for that is by putting their money where their mouth is, by supporting in a person or people who are engaging in learning and in teaching Torah, then that is a substitute. Because of this, the Torah mentions Zavulun before Yisachar. Since the Torah learning of Yisachar was made possible through the support of Zavulun. And so we find in the Mishnah an additional reference that there was a certain Tanaic sage in the Mishnah who was referred to as Shimon, the brother of Azariah. Shimon is described as the brother of Azariah because Azariah was engaged in business and provided the needs of his brother, Shimon, who was engrossed in Torah study. They made an agreement between themselves that Azariah would have a share in Shimon's reward for Torah study. Even so, every person should do his utmost to study Torah, even just a little, every day and every night. So Zavulun take a share in Shimon's Torah, in Yisachar's Torah study. Azariah takes a share in Shimon's Torah study. It doesn't mean he takes a share that he gets less and he gives him a part of it. It's like Ne'ela Echel Ne'ela Me'er. You don't if you light one candle from another candle, the original candle doesn't lose any of its light. And this is also, the notion that we have today, the idea of kollel, that people study in kollel and they get paid a stipend to be able to sit and study Torah. And there are people out there who see it as their privilege to be able to support that. Yeah, and in addition, even if you are doing this, at least a little bit, you should learn a little bit of Torah every day and every night.
This may sound like a bit of a dumb question, but what qualifies as Torah? Obviously there's Chumash and Mishnah, Gemara, Talmud, but does studying like Shulchan Aruch, which tells you about Torah, does that qualify as studying Torah? If you see
Absolutely. He will touch on a little bit in the next halacha. You know what? Let's read the next sefer, and then we'll get back to discuss that question in more detail. A person cannot study Torah full time, but sets aside regular periods of Torah study. By the way, nowadays there's a kind of this divide, if you will. There are people who go to work, and there are people who study Torah. And obviously, the people who go to work also try to study Torah in the evenings or whenever they have time. But I've heard stories of yesteryear. There were many people who they lived their life in such a way that they worked in order to make enough money, and then they had enough money, and then they stopped working and they studied Torah. And then when they ran out of money, they worked again. So a guy would have a grocery store or a hardware store. He would open up, and then he needed $100 to buy food for his family for the day, or to pay his bills, and to buy coal for his ovens. And so he would have the store open until he had that amount of money in the cash register, and then he would close up shop and go home and give the money to his wife or to whatever had to be done. and then go back to the base medrash and study Torah. I think nowadays it would be very hard to have a successful business if you didn't have if your clients couldn't Google your opening hours. I don't know that that would be a viable business. But anyway, but the mindset is certainly something which was
Someone
very
else run it
deeply.
for you.
Sorry?
Have someone else run it for you while you're studying.
Yeah, that's the way to go. The mindset is certainly something which is very deeply entrenched in the Jewish peoples, and yeah, something to work on. Person who cannot study Torah full time, but he sets aside regular periods of Torah study, should use these 10 hours to study the halachas, the laws that occur frequently. So before you study the laws of, the red heifer, study the daily laws of what do you have to do every day, what do you have to do every Shabbos, and which every Jew must know. You should also study the Agados and the Midrashim. They can translate the Agados as the homiletics, the sections of the Talmud and the Medrash, which are not halacha, but more sort of advice for life. Books of ethics, which are based on sacred sources, such as the Midrashim of the rabbis, and perhaps these studies help a man restrain his evil impulses. Fortunate is the man who has made a fixed and unbending resolution to study the book of Chayk Yisrael on a daily basis. And the more a person studies, the more blessing he receives from heaven. So it's very clear from here that all of these things are included in Torah study, right? Laws, scripture, so Chumash, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Agados, Midrashim, Musar, Sifrei Musar, ethics, of course, books of Chassidus, Tanya, and other works of Chassidus. All of that is included in the general umbrella of Torah. And when a person only has a limited amount of time, as we all do, there's a limited amount of time to start studying. So how do you divide your time between different sections? So that's a kind of a subjective question. The Rabbi does talk about that in his Torah. But it really is a subjective question that should be addressed on a one-on-one situation with your rabbi or your mashpia, whatever it is. But the point is that a person should always make sure to have some schedule of studying Jewish law, and also of studying some form of ethics, chassidus, etc. He mentions here the end Chayk Yisrael. Chayk Yisrael is a sefer which he says if you study it every single day, it's amazing. Until today, there are people who study, they call it the Chok, there are people who study the Chayk Yisrael. Chayk Yisrael has a section every day. He reads a section from Chumash, and a section from Mishnayos, and a section from Gemara, and a section from Zohar, and a number of others for him. And until today, I can remember over the years, certain places, so especially I think it's more common in Sephardi circles nowadays, that after davening, the person would, I remember vividly from my youth, in the shul I used to daven in, there was a guy who every single day, he used to sit there for at least a half hour, 45 minutes after everybody else had left, and he was reading the daily Chayk Yisrael. So does that answer your question, Jeremiah?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. When you're studying Torah, you need to go out. Sorry, when you're studying Torah and you need to go out, you should not leave the book open because this causes you to forget what you learned. So if you're taking a break, you have to go to the restroom, take a phone call, whatever it is. So then you have to close the book. Now, some people have a custom that if they're going out for a very brief break, so you don't want to close the book because you want to be able to keep your place. So you could put a bookmark or you could put another book on top of it. So it's you keep your place, but it's covered, so it's like a little bit more respectful. So the pasuk can bring that if you're going out just for a couple of moments, that's fine. But if you're making a longer break, then you should actually close the book. Of course, you could always leave a bookmark. A person should be careful in whatever he studies to pronounce the words with his lips and to make it audible for his ears. For it is written, the book of the Torah shall not leave your mouth, and you shall meditate on it. So it says about leaving your mouth. So you have to say the words of Torah, pronounce them verbally. It's not just enough to read the book, you have to pronounce it. Now there's, this is a concept which in the Alter Rebbe's Hilchos Talmud Torah, he elaborates on this very greatly, on demonstrating that this is the case he talks about this a lot, about the obligation specifically, not just to study Torah, but to verbalize, to recite with your mouth the words that you are hearing. The Alter Rebbe says that when you learn with a chavrusa, when you go to a class or to a chavrusa, so then there's a concept of shemei kaina, that just like when I make kiddush, I could say it loud and you listen to my kiddush, and that discharges your obligation to say kiddush. So similarly, when I study Torah and you're listening to me, then you discharge your obligation of reciting it with your mouth. Now, the problem is that l'chayra, that would not work for a phone or a Zoom or anything like that, because even though you're hearing me talk, you're not actually hearing me. You're hearing some digital vibration of whatever it is that, however the audio on your speaker system, it works. You're not actually hearing a human voice. Just like I could not, let's say, read the Megillah for you over Zoom, and you would not fulfill your obligation of listening to Megillah by hearing it on Zoom, according to most authorities. So when you listen to a class on Zoom, then the chayra, according to that, you should actually not just listen to me, you should also read the words. There is a counter argument to say that the exception to the rule is if when you don't say the words, you'll be able to concentrate better. If you'll be able to concentrate better on the information that you're learning by reading it without verbalizing the words, so then that's allowed. So perhaps you can make the argument that if you had to say all the words that I was, reading together with me, it might be more distracting, and so that may not be necessary. But that's just an interesting discussion.
I heard a story about this where they said that the Rebbe was the one that made this particular ruling about digital, because he had studied electronics when he was in the army or something. Have you heard this?
Yeah. The Rebbe didn't make it. The Rebbe called attention to it. I think in the early years, and in the 40s and the 50s, even there was a lack of awareness. There was lack of awareness of how electricity and all how the engineering of all these things works, and the Rebbe brought awareness to it. I don't think the Rebbe essentially really sort of had any novelty opinion. Last year, when there was, the second Purim of Corona, when there were still some people, everybody has their approach to COVID, but there were some rabbis who said, look, if you're not going to hear the Megillah, better hear it on Zoom than not hear it at all, which I think it's a balance, because often when you give a halachic advisory, you have to be careful. There's the here and now, and then there's the long-term effect, the impact of what you're saying, sort of as a policy. And so if you tell somebody, if you're not going to hear Megillah, then hear it on Zoom, better than nothing, and you just take that in a vacuum, adjust that particular thing, so then okay, because even if you're not going to be to the mitzvah, maybe there is some opinion that it does work, and even if there's no opinion that it works, at least you remember that it's Purim, and it keeps you connected, at least emotionally or spiritually, to Purim. But I think that there's a very strong concern that it could lead to, the slippery slope, that how do you know how many people who were going to push themselves to go out to hear the Megillah, but then they heard, oh, there's an option to do it on Zoom, and anyway, it's COVID, and anyway, it's Friday, and it's a busy day, so they'll just hear it on Zoom. And it's not just this year, and years from now, that's it. Why should I rush home from work and make myself crazy to hear the Megillah in person? I could just hear it on Zoom. And so I think that there's definitely an argument to be made against those rabbis who advised better to hear it on Zoom than not to hear it. But certainly everyone agrees, even those rabbis who did put out that statement, they also agree that the only sort of proper way of fulfilling the mitzvah is to hear it live, not digitally. Even with a microphone, where you're in the same room as the person. There's actually an interesting thing. And by a chuppah, so the chassan gives the ring to the kala, and he tells her, "I'm hereby betrothed you to me." Yep. And that sentence that the chassan says has to be heard by two witnesses. And so there are some rabbis who are strict that the chassan should not say it into the microphone, because then the witnesses will be hearing the sounds from the microphone over the sound directly out of the chassan's mouth. So
couldn't you
pay
argue that
attention next time
you're
chopper.
hearing both, though, that you're hearing his voice and the microphone?
Yeah, no, you could, and that's probably the argument of those rabbis who are not careful about that. But it's a thing, it's something which has been discussed a lot, and then it's also halachically. There's a concept that halachically you can't hear two voices simultaneously, right? If two people are making kiddush simultaneously, then you don't fulfill your obligation of kiddush. You can only hear the kiddush from one person. So, for example, this comes up by the Seder. By the Seder, many people have the custom that everybody says kiddush together, which is fine. But what if you have one person around the table who's not fluent in the Hebrew, and he or she just wants to listen to somebody else making kiddush? So then it's a problem, because you can't listen to 10 people making kiddush. You can only listen to one person making kiddush. Even though scientifically and our human experience, you've heard of every word, halachically, that's not considered hearing. All right, we're running out of time. Let's finish the statement. The person should be careful. Yeah, we said. The person who pronounces the words even though he does not understand the meaning fulfills the mitzvah of Torah study. Therefore, every unlearned person should say the bracha of Torah every morning before reciting the words of Rachacha, and also when he's called up to say for Torah. Anyone who engages in Torah study but is unable to understand it for the lack of knowledge will merit to understand it in the world to come. So he's saying, even if you don't understand it, if you just have the Kabbalah soil sort of submission that this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to study Torah, then you do fulfill the mitzvah just by pronouncing the words even without understanding them. However, it doesn't say this here explicitly, but that is only when it comes to the written Torah, scripture, Torah, Nevi'im, and Ksuvim, Tanakh. But when it comes to the oral Torah, anything else, the laws, the halachas, the Mishnah, etc., there you do not fulfill the mitzvah of studying Torah if you just say the words and don't understand it. All right, that's the end of the chapter. Any questions before we log out?
So does that mean that if, for example, you don't understand the words in Hebrew, would it be better to say them in Hebrew regardless, or to say it in English?
That's a very good question. There's an argument to be made in both directions. And I think the answer ultimately is a bit of both. Meaning, let's say a person who doesn't understand the Hebrew when they're saying Psalms, which even I myself, I don't know if I should be saying this on record, but I don't always understand all the Psalms if I don't take the time to read it in the English or to study the commentaries. But I think both are true. If a person is able, obviously if a person can't read Hebrew, can't read Hebrew, but if a person has a choice between reading it in Hebrew and not understanding it and reading in English and yes, understanding, so there are virtues to be made and arguments to be made in both directions. And I think that there should probably be some sort of balance where you do some in Hebrew because there is value to saying it, the original words and those letters and those words contain within them a certain sanctity and symbol, etc. And then there's also other opportunities to say it in English so that it helps you understand it. And the more you say it in English, the more you'll understand it and be able to say more in Hebrew as well. All right. Good night, all y'all.